if you could maybe tell us a little bit about your research, what you intend to do, and how it relates to the broader project of the Aggressor.
I've been working on mostly the post-Yugoslav space. I'm interested in particular in the legacies of the 1990s, as well as questions of democratization and regimes currently in the Western Balkans. For this particular project, I'm interested in very much in how the 1990s are debated, in particular in Serbia today, but also in the larger region. In particular, also how these discussions about the past, who was the aggressor, who was responsible for the wars, feeds into contemporary narrative, political claims, but also the larger positionality of the countries and societies in Europe.
Could you please elaborate on the methodological aspects of your research? What type of conceptual approaches you use?
This particular angle, of course, focuses mostly on contemporary debates. So here media are central. So media analysis, discourse analysis. I'm interested in the way in which the wars of the 90s are portrayed in regime media. So there one looks at tabloids, which are controlled by the government, for example, or talk shows.
Can you maybe give us a little bit of an overview about how, or like regarding how people across former Yugoslavia remember the role the republics played during the Yugoslav wars?
Basically, I mean, the wars themselves were fought out of a sense of being victim. Many Croats thought that they were victimized by Serbia and Yugoslavia. Many Serbs thought that they were disadvantaged within Yugoslavia by the other nations. Many Albanians thought they were victimized by Serbs in Yugoslavia. When we're looking at it today, we have these very different ways of looking at the wars of the 1990s. They even have different names. In Croatia, it's called the Homeland War. In the Republika Srpska, the Fatherland War. In the rest of Bosnia, it would be called the aggression. So in that sense, you can already see that the wars have different names. They're not seen as one war, and they're kind of taken apart and reinterpreted through their respective national framework.
Are there any dominant images or portrayals of individual aggressors, individual figures?
Of course, there are certain individuals which are seen as representatives of a threat. In the case of Serbia, it might be the wartime president of Croatia, Franjo Tudjman, who is often portrayed as a fascist, as a nationalist. Among the Bosniaks, one finds, by the Serbian side, one finds some politicians like Alija Izetbegovic, who was the wartime president. But again, they don't give for a good villain. And similarly, among Albanians, then you portray some of the political leaders like Hashim Thaçi. Again, they all don't make great villains for the narrative. In the past, we often found, for example, NATO leaders or leaders of the NATO leading countries at the time being portrayed as aggressors. Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, Gerhard Schröder, who were the kind of leading politicians at the time of the NATO intervention. But ironically, the current Serbian government hired Tony Blair as their advisor. Gerhard Schröder is more famous for his pro-Russian policies nowadays, and there's a nice picture of Serbian President Vučić embracing Bill Clinton. So they don't make for good villains anymore. The reduction or the kind of blending out of the individual aggressor allows for a greater collapse of time, because then it's not about who was responsible in the 90s as an individual, but it's rather collectives. And then again, those collectives are a threat today because it's not about the leaders. It's about all Croats, all Albanians, and so on. And I think this then again makes it easier to kind of portray the continuity of threat, because it's not about the leader, but it's about the nation, which is a threat, the collective enemy.
Would you say or argue that nationalism is inherently aggressive or aggression inherently nationalistic?
We have a history of aggression in the human history well before the rise of nations and nationalism. I mean, nationalism being a modern phenomena. So I don't think we could say that aggression is always linked to nationalism. But I think in our contemporary world, nationalism is the main way of justifying aggression.
Do you see a potential for future wars in the process of EU enlargement?
It's very important to distinguish between the memory wars, the contestation of memory and historical narratives, to real wars. I sometimes say in the EU, this often says we have to resolve all bilateral disputes. And I say, well, sometimes some bilateral disputes are maybe better not to be resolved. The idea that the European Union has a role in resolving them prior to accession especially is naive. In fact, it might make it harder to resolve. Forgetting those issues is probably the best which can happen, rather than kind of trying to solve them at the expense of maybe making them even more politically salient.